I'm here to answer the question, how to make brown stock and brown sauce. This is a very complex question, and it has a very complex answer. There's an old saying in cooking, the simpler the food, the more complex. Obviously, the making of a brown stock can appear to be very simple, and it is. I'm going to take you into the whole process of making brown stock and brown sauce in this video. This is probably the longest video in the entire index. There's 8 or 9 different categories of information that we're going to cover. It's going to include the selecting of the bones, the type of bones, how the bones are cut, how the bones are browned, how the vegetables and aromatics that go into the pot are cooked, what type of pot to select, the amount of food bones that should be proportionally in any size pot, how the pot itself is loaded, how the stock itself is brought to a simmer and cooked, and over what period of time, how it's skimmed, how it's nurtured and babysat throughout the entire cooking process. Then finally, after that process is completed, which usually takes 1.5 to 2.5 days, then the straining of the stock, and then the reducing of the stock into brown sauce, or what we call glace de viande in French cooking, which means in English concentrated brown stock. We're going to begin the process of learning how to make brown stock by walking you through the selection of all the bones that we have and the vegetables and how they're cut first. So let's go there now. The first step in making brown stock is understanding how to select the bone, or the type of bone, and why you would be selecting that bone over another bone to make the stock. Let's begin with the primary 2 bones that are used to make brown stock, which are beef and veal bones, and/or. Some people mix them together. Some people use exclusively beef bones. Some people use exclusively veal bones. There's a misguided notion in the cooking world that veal bones are better than beef bones. This is not correct, and the quality of the stock and the sauce is determined by the cook, not by the bone, whether it be veal or beef. One can make a great brown stock or brown sauce from beef bones or veal bones, or they can mix them together. So, in terms of beef bones, which is what we're going to demonstrate for you in this video, and we're going to talk about the veal bones also. The selection of the bone should be the pipe, which is also called the femur bone, and the knuckle bones. What I have in front of me right here are some examples of what those bones look like. These 3 here are the femur bones, or the pipe bones. They are also called the marrow bones. As you can see, there's marrow in the inside of these bones. And this, formerly, was a whole knuckle bone that's been cut in half. Now, there are other pieces of beef bones that one can incorporate into this, but the knuckle and the shin would be the primary bones used for making beef stock in the commercial market. If you went to buy bones and you wanted to buy a 10-pound box of bones or a 50-pound box, they typically would be divided and graded by the type of bone. Marrow bones would be the most expensive bones in the marketplace, and in terms of veal and beef bones like that for browning. Now, the size of the bone is very important, and I'll tell you why. You're going to brown all of your bones when you make the brown stock, and the amount of browned surface that's available on the bone to be browned will help determine, and mostly determine, the level of brown taste and brown color in the final stock and sauce. So, let's take, for example, let's take this bone here, which isn't cut up that much. This is a knuckle bone, okay? Now, this bone has X amount of brown surface on it, or brownable surface on it, excuse me. Now, if I cut this bone into 4 pieces, I create more brownable surfaces, which means in the final analysis, I'm going to have a browner stock and a browner sauce. Okay, so you don't want a big bone like that because you have less brownable surface, and therefore you'll have less brown flavor and brown color. Okay? So we begin by saying 1.5 to 3 inch pieces of bones, give or take, would be a good size to have your butcher cut the bones for you. Okay? Now, why would one select beef bones over veal bones in terms of the cooking time? There is a consideration there. Beef bones versus veal bones. Beef bones, which come from an older animal, and they are harder and more dense, take a longer amount of cooking time to extract the flavor. Beef bones typically take 2 full days to extract the flavor. Veal bones you can extract the flavor from in 1.5 days, but cooks typically cook them also for 2 days, but they don't absolutely have to, as in the case of the beef. One thing to keep in mind in general about the cooking of your bones, whether it be veal or beef, and that is that the flavor of the bones, the final flavors of the bones, are released in the last few hours of the cooking time of the stock. So if you take the stock off early, you may, even though you're shaving maybe 25% of the cooking time off, you could end up losing 50 to 75% of the flavor. So that, I think, covers the selection of the bones and how they're cut. And now we're going to take you across a table here that is full of bones, and we're going to begin the process of making a large pot. Then I'm going to show you all the ingredients that are going to go into it, step by step. We're back to doing the bone processing for the brown veal or beef stock in brown sauce. One of the things I haven't mentioned to you so far, which is absolutely essential for you to understand about stock in general, is that stock is defined as flavored water. So all stock begins as water, and then we put things into the water and simmer them in the water, and the water takes on a flavor of whatever that is, and that's what the stock is. Okay? So we've talked about the selection of the bone, the cutting of the bone. Now I'm going to talk to you about how much bones to put in the pan. You only want to put enough bones in the pan, and as you see here, we have about 150 pounds of bones here. Of course, your recipe in the index, of course, is only for 10 pounds of bones, which should go into a 24 quart aluminum gauge, heavy aluminum gauge stock pot. So the reason you don't want them overloaded or piled is because you want them to be able to brown all the way around. If the heat cannot get in the pan by moving through the bones, it cannot brown the sides of the bone because it's being trapped by another bone. Okay? And you will, of course, during the roasting process, be turning the bones. Now, there's an additional option that the cook has in terms of making the bones browner than they normally brown naturally without anything added to them. And that is that one can take either oil or clarified butter and spray the bones with them prior to the browning process, prior to putting them in the oven to roast and brown. It will enhance the browning. Ultimately, we'll end up with a deeper brown and more brown flavor. And remember, the definition of good brown stock is how brown it is and how brown it tastes. Okay? So this is just one more element, which I don't always do myself when I'm making large amounts, but sometimes when I'm making small amounts, 10, 20 pounds of bones at a time, I may enhance them by spraying them with clarified butter or olive oil. So we'll spray this one, which I started with the olive oil. We'll see if it makes any difference, because you're going to see the entire process of all these bones being roasted, being turned in the ovens, being placed into the pots, having the water added to them, and the entire 2-day cooking process you're going to see in this video, time elapsed, of course, okay? So we're moving down here now. These are all, again, beef, shin, and knuckle and marrow bones that we have. We have about 150 pounds here. And we have celery, we have onions, we have carrots, and we have whole garlic. And we have bay leaves, we have dried leaf thyme, and we have tomato paste. These would be the primary ingredients for brown stock. All the things that are on this table that I just mentioned. People add other things from time to time, but these would be the primary infrastructure ingredients for making brown stock. One could adulterate, change, modify, enhance, or do, quote, their thing on the brown stock, but it would always include these ingredients, and then maybe something else. which I won't go into because that's not what this particular instructional video is about. This is about how to make brown stock, the traditional, tested and unchallenged way. So we're going to put all these bones in the oven right now. And I just happen to have a whole bunch of ovens lined up here. Of course, one of the great things about this particular kitchen at this academy is the amount of cooking ovens we have. So let's get this in here. Now, the cooking of the vegetables takes place after the bones are cooked. First, we cook the bones, then we take all the marrow and the fat that has been rendered from the bones, and we cook the vegetables in that. And I have all these bones at about 375 to 400 degrees. You can go a little higher, a little lower, cook them a little faster, a little shorter. But in the final analysis, you want to brown the bone to the farthest possible point that it can be browned before it starts to burn. Of course, at any time, if you develop any small carbon deposits of black burnt bone or parts of it on the bone, one would take a hand grater and grate that off prior to that bone going into the stock pot. All right, so that covers the placing of the bones in the pan and the putting them in the oven. We're going to come back with a little bit of time elapsed, probably in about a half an hour, 45 minutes, and we're going to turn these bones around and take a look at how they're doing. Coming back to making brown stock, roasting bones, and now turning the bones, okay? The bones that I have in this oven right here, about 45 minutes has elapsed since we put these bones in the oven for you, okay? Pull the rack out, and we're just going to move the bones around a little bit to get a little bit of even browning going on in here. How do they say? Let no bone go unturned. You know, come on. There we go. They're looking good. And they probably got another 45 minutes. Now, you better not have been counting those bones saying, hey, wait a minute, I don't think he turned that one bone right there, okay? We got them all turned, okay? So we put it back in the oven, and we'll come back to that in, say about an hour and a half or so, or 45 minutes rather. What am I saying, an hour and a half? And then we'll take a look, and they might be done then. If they're not, we'll roll them around a little bit more and give them another 15 minutes, half an hour, whatever it's going to take. All right, we'll be back with time elapsed bone roasting. It's been 45 minutes since I spoke to you last about these bones. Now, we were in this oven right here looking at these bones earlier, and they're all done. And as you can see, all the oven doors are open for the bones that we put in earlier. Now, I'm going to take these bones out. They are looking really good, and we'll set them right up here. You can get a good look at them. And we're going to talk about the size and type of pot that the bones are going to go into here also. Now, this, of course, is a 20-quart pot, 22-quart pot, which is the size you would use at your house. This would be the medium size of the ones one would probably use commercially, and this would be the larger size of the one that one would use commercially. Now, heavy gauge aluminum, there's a reason for that. If you use light gauge aluminum or any kind of stainless steel for long-term cooking, the metallic taste of the pot will be transferred to the stock, and the stock will be no good. And you'll have to throw the stock away. It'll be that no good, okay? So heavy gauge aluminum is very important, okay? Which is what we have here. And I'm going to take the bones from this particular pot. I'm going to put them in here. Ouch. You'll notice that the bottom of this roasting pan here is loaded with fat. That is, of course, the melted marrow. See, there's a marrow bone right there that you can see through now because all that marrow is right here. And we're going to cook our vegetables, the celery, carrots, and onions, also referred to within the language of cooking as mirepoix, into the stock pot. Mirepoix would always include the idea, of aromatic vegetables, okay? These are nice looking bones, and they have a nice brown color. Now, one of the differences between browning the bones, of course, and the vegetables that go into the pot is vegetables don't brown the same way bones do. So you would never try to get the vegetables brown. You want to get them a little brown, but that's all you're going to get out of it, is a little brown. Main thing is that they're really cooked and they're really tender. All right, so now we got ourselves a pan full of marrow here. So I'm going to just give this a little bit of flame here. We're going to add some onions. And some carrots. And some celery. And the idea that one wouldn't use the leaves of the celery, although is well intended, is certainly not a strict rule of thumb when making stock. It doesn't make the stock bitter just because the leaf has a slightly bitter taste to it. Okay. Now, of course, this roasting pan is not designed for stovetop cooking. I'm just getting it warmed up a little bit. And we're going to put some dried leaf thyme on there. And we're going to put some bay leaves on here. And we're going to mix that up a little bit. Now, if your bones don't have enough marrow to satisfy the needs of cooking the vegetables in some fat, then supplement that marrow with a little bit of butter or some olive oil so that you have enough oil to transfer the heat to the vegetables and cook them. Okay, so now I'm going to pop this back in that oven that the bones were in, and we'll finish cooking the vegetables in the oven. Now we're going to time-elapse the cooking now. And the removal of all these other bones, I'm going to get them all divided into these two pots here, which is the amount of pot space I think I need for this much bone. We're going to divide them all in here and get all the mirepoix cooking in the oven. And then when all the mirepoix is cooked, we're going to come back on a time-elapse basis. Okay, we are back right now, like I said. And the mirepoix has all been browned. I have all the mirepoix, celery, carrots, and onions, and the garlic bulbs that I cut in half. I sprayed with a little bit of oil, and I toasted them just a little bit too. That's an option. You don't have to toast the garlic. And now, the important thing to remember is that during the cooking process, the removal of all of the insoluble particles that rise to the surface of the stock in the form of both fat and scum, as it's called, need to be removed throughout the cooking process with a ladle. So because we know that we have fat that we cooked all the vegetables in, we're going to drain the vegetables before we even put them in the pot. Otherwise, we'll just have to skim the fat off. Because the value of the marrow has been maximized already by us in the cooking of the vegetables. So we're going to drain all of the vegetables into this pan here. And then after we get the vegetables drained, we will put the tomato paste and the garlic into the pot, and we will top the pot off with water. The garlic, of course, here does not need to be drained, so I'm just going to put it directly into the pots because it really wasn't cooking in oil per se. Okay. And the onions. And finally, the balance of the carrots. So there you have a nicely cooked mirepoix. It has some brown qualities, but particularly, excuse me, cooked quality. All right. So we'll take our mirepoix that's fairly well drained, and we will divide it up among these two pots with that garlic that's already in there. I think that's light enough for me to lift up now effectively. Okay. See, look at all that fat that we saved from putting inside of our pot. Okay. Now, we will add the tomato paste. Now, some cooks will tell you that the tomato paste should be spread over the bones during the cooking process. That is certainly an option and not a requirement. There's 3 or 4 small differences that can be used as the influence by the cook to make the stock. That would be one of them. I elect not to do that and add the tomato paste directly to it because I don't think it enhances the tomato paste to spread it over the bones. In effect, it covers the bones, and certain parts of the bones can't brown because they have tomato paste on them. And the browning of the tomato paste itself is just about inconclusive in terms of the final effects. So, we'll put the tomato paste in, which is the amount consistent with the recipe that you have in the index for the brown stock. And we are going to cook these 2 pots for 2 days. And we are going to come back in 2 days, and that's also going to be in a now type thing. I'm going to top this off with the water. Don't top it off completely, of course. Now, I'd like to emphasize something to you about the proportion of bones in the pot. The bones need to have enough room in the pot to, so to speak, microscopically move about during the cooking process. You don't want so many bones on top of the other bones that they're pressed against the bottom of the pot and they're unmovable during the cooking process. They need to move gently as the small amount of turbulence that's created in the pot forces them to move. But if they're weighted down, then they cannot do that. And bones pressed against the bottom of the pot can burn much more easily too. So that's why you don't want to have too much. These pots are filled halfway with bones. And for these size pots, that's the right size. Originally, earlier in this video, I had this pot and another one slightly smaller. But as I put the bones in the pot, I thought the other pot was too small, so I included a second large pot for the very reason that I just told you. So we'll be back in a few minutes after this comes to a simmer. And one of the things you should keep in mind is that when you're bringing the pots up to the simmer, you bring them up slowly. And you will remove the scum and fat as it comes up. And we will do that, and then I will demonstrate how that's done when it comes to a simmer. So I can show you a close-up of the level of simmering and the bubble activity and turbulence that should be in the pot throughout the entire cooking process. Okay, we got all the mirepoix and all the bones into the pots with all the cold water. And we slowly brought the temperature of the pots up to the point at which it's simmering right now. And I have next to the pots the officially named scum pot, if you will, which is the name in which these pots are given because you use them to put the scum in that you remove with the ladle or the fat. Okay, so I'm removing some of the fat with the ladle, and you just make sure that all the fat is generally off of most of the pots throughout the entire cooking time. couple things to remember here now. The temperature at which it cooks. It should never boil. Boiling the stock will make it cloudy, and it will cause so much turbulence in the water that it will cause the scum and the fat to be regenerated and recycled back into the stock. And ultimately your stock will taste, or your sauce when you're finished, will taste like fat or scum, if you will. So it's always just barely simmered, and we're going to bring the camera right in close, tight in a minute here to show you a level that the water should be moving with what we would call simmering of the stock. That's one thing to remember, the speed at which it's cooked. It's cooked slowly, okay? Second thing to remember is that the only thing that ever leaves the stock pot throughout the cooking process is water. So one continues to top off the pots with water throughout the cooking process to maintain the level of the water so that the turbulence is constant and consistent throughout the entire time the stock is cooking. Those would be two very, very important things. And we're going to bring you over here now and show you the level at which it should be taking place. So come on over here with that camera. Okay. Now, the removal of the fat and the scum, one should always be cognizant of the fact that you want to leave the stock behind and don't take stock. So you're just taking the fat off the top. If you have to leave a little bit on from time to time so that you don't end up taking stock and fat off at the same time, leave a little bit on so that it'll accumulate enough so you're just removing the fat, okay? Now you see the level at which that's simmering. It shouldn't be simmering beyond that level there, okay? And the same with this little pot over here. Some of that fat off too. And you'll notice this one is cooking at the same rate. Nice and gently. And that's the speed at which the pot should be cooking the entire time. All right, we're going to let 2 days elapse now, and we're going to come back here in 48 hours, and we're going to see what this stock looks like, and then we are going to proceed to take the stock from the pot, and then we are going to make two things from it. We're going to make the brown sauce, or what's traditionally known in French cooking as Espagnole sauce. We will make what we consider to be the modern version of this, and we will also make glace de viande, or what's also called in English concentrated beef stock. And those two things I'll have for you in 2 days of these pots cooking, and you will see a big difference in the way this stock looks. Right now you look at the stock and what you see is a little tomato watery looking stuff. You see? In 2 days when we go back in here with this ladle, which is the next scene you're going to see that this is going to be deep dark brown. And it's not going to have that tomatoey look to it at all, okay? And then we're going to proceed to complete this. At the end of making the brown sauce in glace de viande, we're going to sit down and I'm going to recap the entire process of making the stock with you in summary one more time. So you can go to this video both on the front end and during the process or at the end to get the summary of the information. I'll see you in 2 days, which is going to be in about 1 minute or less. All right, those 2 days have now elapsed, and our stock pots have been cooking for 2 days. Here, you will see a large container of fat and scum. That's how much was removed over the last 2 days from these two pots, okay? Now, we're going to bring you inside so you can see what the color of that stock was. I told you that you would see a deep, dark brown, but that would certainly be different than that watery tomato look that it had 2 days ago. So we're going to bring you over here now to take a look at that real quick. Rolling. Okay. Look at these beautiful pots. Now this one was cooking a little bit less than this one. See, this one reduced a lot. Now I did top these off with cold water a couple of times, and now there's still a little bit of fat on here. We're going to take the balance of that fat off of there. And that back into the junk pot again. And we'll do the same thing over here. Real quick, so you can see, look, this is a 1 quart ladle. Look at that, just taking off a whole quart of fat coming off of there. This is, of course, is just a larger version of what you might make at home if this is something you're making at home. Now, I want you to see what that stock looks like now. You see how nice and brown that is? That's no longer that tomatoey, watery look. Same thing over here in the other pot. See how nice and brown that juice is? That's beautiful. All right, we're gonna cut back for a minute now, and we're gonna go to straining of these stocks, and we're gonna begin a discussion about the process of reducing the stocks, the principles involved in reducing, and the techniques, and then we are gonna move to brown sauce. Okay, we're gonna strain now some of the brown stock into a couple of small saucepans, and we're gonna begin the reducing process, and we're gonna talk about the principles involved in the reducing process. But first, let's get some of the stock strained. And I'm straining it through a fine strainer, and it doesn't have to be strained through a strainer quite this fine initially, but ultimately it will have to be. This is a chinois strainer, which is a strainer that has a screen, and chinois, of course, means Chinese in French. So this is the French term for this kind of strainer. So a very good way to get your stock and sauce through the strainer is by pounding it down with a ladle, which is what I'm doing. This would certainly be the most efficient way of doing this. Okay. Now, important to understand is that all of the stuff that's in this pot is garbage now, besides the broth. Okay? Now we're going to set these to cook, or reduce, I should say, and we are going to set the pots, the saucepans, slightly off center on the stove. And the reason we're doing that is so that during the process of when the stock is reducing, the turbulence inside the pot will force all the scum and insoluble particles to be collected along one side of the pot. If we keep the pot directly over the flame, it'll cause the scum and the fat to continually be recycled into the sauce, okay? So, while that's reducing, I'm going to pull up a chair and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what that means. Now, there are mainly only two reasons why anyone would reduce anything. Reducing would be defined as boiling down, okay? First, one should always know that the only thing that leaves the pot during the boiling down or reducing process is water, which means that if I take 4 cups of brown stock and I boil it down by 50% and make it into 2 cups, what I really have now is 2 cups of liquid that have the flavor of 4 cups in it. Less volume, more concentrated flavor. So the boiling down includes only 2 things: reducing the volume of liquid and concentrating the flavor. Reducing really has no other function in itself. There are things that one can do during the reducing process to utilize the reducing process, like throwing herbs in it to extract the flavor from it and things like that. But the primary reasons why one would reduce it would be to reduce the volume of liquid, makes it easier to store, and to concentrate the flavor. Okay. We're going to let these reduce down now for about whatever length of time it takes. Probably going to be about 15 or 20 minutes. So we're going to elapse some time, and I'm going to be back at 15 minutes worth of actual cooking time. Okay, so now you've seen the brown stock after the 2 days of it cooking. And let's just recap the whole process of making the stock for a moment, if we could. The selection of the bone, the size of the bone being cut for more browning, the type of pan and how the bones are placed in the pan so that they're not stacked, the amount of the roasting time was covered, the brownness level of the bones, the cooking of the celery, carrots, and onions in the marrow from the bones, the slow process of bringing the stock up with cold water, and that the stock is never boiling at any time. There's never a lid on any of these stock pots at any time. And then the nurturing of the pot, if you will, by the skimming of the insoluble particles that come to the surface, which are called fat and scum, respectively. And then the topping off of the pot with cold water throughout the cooking process. That would be the end of part one of this is a two-part video, brown stock and then brown sauce. These two items are intrinsically linked in cooking, although there are many uses for plain brown stock. The biggest use tends to be for brown sauce. Okay, so we're going to move to brown sauce now. That will begin with the straining of the stock. Okay, now these three rondeaux, or sautoirs as they're also called in French, are perfect for reducing large amounts of liquids because the surface space is so high. I took all the stock from those three pots and put them into these three rondeaux, and they are reducing. In your pot, if you had only 10 pounds of bones, you'd just be reducing it in a smaller pot, that's all, but basically it's the same. The concept that great cooking or good cooking mainly takes place in a professional environment is certainly a misguided notion, because I'll say one thing about good cooking and good food, and that is wherever it goes, there it is. And so I would certainly say that the best meals you'll ever have are probably in someone's house. Anyway, I'll skip the philosophy class for now and go back to the brown sauce. So there's your stock that's reducing. And I'll show you now what the brown sauce looks like that I reduced in the little two saucepans. And I changed them out, and they reduced by about 70%. The two saucepans that were just reducing that I showed you, reduced for about 25 minutes, 35 minutes, and I consolidated them into one pan. And we have it down now to about 6 or 7 cups of, quote, brown sauce. Now, if we wanted to reduce it a little bit more, it would be the glace de viande, or the concentrated brown stock that I referred to at the beginning of this recipe. So, in terms of the thickening agents for the brown sauce, in this particular case, we use no thickening agent, and we use what we call the natural reduction to come up with the sauce consistency. Now, sauce consistency would certainly be described as to coat a wooden spoon evenly. But as you can see how that covers that plate, what that consistency is like there, okay? This is some good sauce, too. So that would be your simple brown sauce, which could be used as a complete and finished sauce by itself, just by seasoning it and so on. And you can find multiple recipes for how to use the brown sauce in the index. Usually this sauce is used to make more complex sauces. For example, having reduced red wine that has aromatic vegetables reduced in it with thyme and bay leaf added to the brown sauce to make red wine sauce, and so on. But in this particular case, if you make a 10-pound version like the recipe calls for, you might want to make the brown sauce and divide it up into little styrofoam cup containers and freeze them. And every time you need a little bit, you can just pull it out of the freezer for sauce for 2, 3, or 4 people at a time. And in summary, that would be brown stock part 1 going to brown sauce. The other thickening agents that can be used to thicken the brown sauce, but not quite reduce it as much, and possibly even get slightly more yield, with slightly less depth of flavor as part of that, of course, would be look under the thickening agents and liaisons in the index, and it will give you the whole spectrum of thickening agents that can be used for this and other things. So if you'd like to thicken it with cornstarch or roux or vegetable starch or potato mash or something like that, you can do that. And all of the measured ingredient guidelines and how those formulas of all those thickening agents are administered into the liquid is at the thickening agents and liaisons in the index. So there's your brown sauce.